Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Samuel Kokabi, and I'm the Programs Manager at the Gardiner Museum. Welcome to our first 2024 International Ceramic Art Fair virtual program featuring artist Halima Cassell, represented by Joanna Bird Contemporary Collections in London, UK, who will be in conversation with Gardiner Museum's Chief Curator and Deputy Director, Dr. Sequoia Miller. You may have noticed that your mics and videos are muted and the chat option has been disabled. There will be a Q&A following today's conversation, and so we invite you to send us your questions through the Q&A function at any point. Please note that this conversation is being recorded for internal archives and may be available at a later date on our YouTube channel. Although we are joined here virtually, I do want to acknowledge that the Gardiner Museum operates on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Misagas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. Without further ado, I would now like to welcome Dr. Miller to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Thank you so much, Salma. Hello, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. So glad that you could be here. It is my pleasure to welcome Halima Cassell to this program at the Gardiner Museum. Halima was born in 1975 in Pakistan, brought up in Lancashire, England, and now lives in Shropshire, England. Her varied multicultural background is tangibly present in her work. Recognized as one of the most distinguished dynamic sculptural ceramicists in the United Kingdom, Halima won the Brookfield and Crafts Council Award at Collect in 2024 in recognition of her significant contribution to the national story of contemporary craft. She was awarded an NBE in 2022 for her outstanding achievement in services to the arts. Her recent publication, Halima Cassell 25, documents her 25-year journey and development as an artist up to the present time. Halima has been represented at Collect and in the United States by Joanna Bird Contemporary for 12 years, during which time her work has been acquired by numerous museums and private collections. And with that, I would like to invite Halima to unmute and turn on her camera and join the call. Oh, hello, there we go. Oh, now you're remuted. If you could unmute again.
Okay, yes, no, sorry. Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here and wonderful to be showing with yourselves in Toronto. So that's wonderful. And okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Halima, so we're looking at some images here of a recent work of yours. This is one of the pieces that is on view now at the Gardiner Museum in our International Contemporary Ceramic Art Fair. It's called Tulipa. I love this work. I love the shape. I love the color of the clay. I love the feeling of it. I would love actually to start with hearing from you a bit about your process and how you make your work, sort of how you started with this approach and how you do it.
Okay, I've always had a love and passion for art as a child and mathematics, and I think the combination of those two elements have come together. And when making my work, I go through 4 different processes, and those processes are kind of kept separate in a way. So the first process that I go through is designing. So I have notebooks from college days, from university, and every time I'm thinking, I have a project or commission, everything's designed and jotted into the notebook. So that's the first process, is designing, which I really enjoy because it allows your mind to run free. And during the process of design, I don't tend to think about the technical elements because that can affect that flow of thinking. The second process is the form that I'm working with, making that by hand, whether it's coil built, former built, or a solid piece of clay which is hit into shape. So getting that as perfect as possible as a form is important, so that the design can be mapped around it precisely. And also, because of the solid or thick walls of the forms that I work with, it's important not to get air bubbles, or and which can cause explosion and cracks in the kiln. So that's really important when making the forms. So that's more kind of where I'm really concentrating technically. The third process is mapping the design that I chose onto the form that I made, and that I use various measuring and instruments, compasses, rulers, protractors, various things to map the design, which before I start mapping it, I put a grid around the form, which then the design is accurately mapped around. So again, this is kind of more a technical, precise kind of process. And then the final process is carving, and much like the designing, it's a very enjoyable process. It's very slow, but because of the process, which I enjoy so much, which in some ways can be quite meditative. So that paring away on the almost dry clay. So I start carving into the piece when it's in between leather dry and completely dry. So it's got a stiffness to it. But as I come to the final depths and surfaces that I want, the clay is almost dry. So you get really good precision. And with the clay being hard, you don't distort any of the sharp edges and that. But so I tend to work on one piece at a time as well when it comes to clay. So that my mind and thought are on it, and it's not something that I can dip in and out of. I tend to do long hours, like 12 to 16 hours at a time.
Right.
So then that flows there, so you can really feel, especially when you've got a repeat or a symmetry of 16 or 5, when you're carving that same shape, you need to get into it. And once you've got that surface on all of them, then you might decide to take it in deeper, or you might decide to carve the planes a bit more into themselves, so they're kind of come working into the shape. So I kind of play around with that, and that's part of the process and the enjoyment and the excitement of carving the clay, because especially when the form is carved inside and outside the form, because you're constantly working out which way you've carved on one side to the other side, so how deep you can go into that side. So that it's challenging and it's exciting, and it's always pushing me all the time. And I tend, as with my practice, I only carve that design once, and that's it. And then for me, I think once that design's revealed, I've gone for that excitement, then it's a new design that I want to work with.
It's interesting that you work on only one piece at a time, because it feels like each piece, although they're so closely related to each other, each piece very much has its own logic, its own sort of internal structure or system in a way. They're almost like, and you've brought in this, the importance for you of math or mathematics, they're almost like equations in a way. They have a certain kind of argument or logic to them. And so I can sort of picture you in a way, kind of falling into the logic of the work and being almost entirely inside of it in a sense. Do you feel that each piece does have this kind of internal logic that you get into, and so keeps you in that mindset?
Yeah, I mean that's why the long hours come into play, because it's hard, because once you're kind of in that kind of mindset, it's hard just to dip out of. And for me, sometimes working through the night, it's a lot easier because I get no distractions. So I can have music on, and I can, and also working on that long period of time, coming back to it and then reassessing it. So yes, that connection and that kind of problem solving is with each piece, but very different with each piece, because each design is different. Each clay that I might be working with has its different qualities and, I suppose, advantages and disadvantages. So all of that adds into the way you work with the clay as well.
You've mentioned each design being unique, and once you finish a piece, you kind of move on to a different design. And I'm also thinking of your note that you've been keeping these books, for some years. I'm curious if you kind of go back through them. If you think of all of the sketches that you made, and we're looking now at, a page from your sketchbook or your design book, I'm curious sort of whether you feel like they're all current, or have you noticed them evolving or changing in a particular way over the years?
Yeah, I think from my very early work, I think it was 2006 before I put a curve into my work. Everything was rectilinear, very masculine, very strong. And then I suppose I got to that age where I was getting a bit curvy, and so did the work.
Right.
Adding the curve into the carving process obviously used a different technique with the wrist, so everything was quite choppy and sharp. But as the works developed, I think the designs and how deep the confidence in the carving and how much I push the clay. So some parts are super thin, millimeters, and sometimes you can almost see the light shining through. So I think I challenge the clay a lot more. Once I know the clay, if it's a clay that I use regularly, then I'm always pushing that clay. But and I suppose depending where you are in your mind and your mindset or emotionally, the way you respond to that design is different. So I suppose as I'm getting older, my kind of thought process and my thinking, and I suppose it's always changing. And so the way you respond to each design or that piece, and how far you push it depends. Yeah, definitely.
Mhm. I'd love to ask you more about depth in the carving, because I think one thing that's so beautiful and interesting about your work is the depth and the curves, and how you create these sort of twisting planes that sort of come into and out of view as you move around the piece, and they capture the light and the shadow in different ways depending on how they're lit, and again how you move around them. And I guess I'm curious sort of how clearly your direction in terms of depth and angle of the carving. So you you map out this, you generate the design, you map it onto the work. Like, how much do you know as you start kind of going into it, literally and figuratively, whether it'll be angled a little this way or a little that way, or a little looser or a little more open?
I think for me, because when I've done like project work or commission work, because everything starts with a 2D design. So for me, that's enough to kind of visually imagine it in my head, how it's going to look, but how deep and how much I twist those planes of those and the angles of that form, it depends, because that is part of the journey of carving into it. So I know which parts I want, what lines I want to follow through to another, so it almost looks like a twist or a fold or a bit of drapery going on into the piece. And also, once you've got a plane running through, just by it convexing it or concaving it, that kind of form then kind of runs through. So I think as the work developed, taking it away from looking like the form that it originated from, so you kind of distort it to the point that you see the edges of the form, but the light and the shadows are playing dramatically. So that's what catches your eyes. And I think for me, growing up as a child in places like Manchester and Liverpool, where the architecture is very rich, with terracotted mouldy buildings, with hand-carved stone, growing up with that kind of richness, and then with my own cultural background, I think that richness of pattern and tactile kind of buildings were really important, and the beauty of when light's shining onto a beautiful building and the shadows it casts, and that kind of personality of that building changes throughout the day. And I think for me, that's something I try to capture in my work, that kind of, it's never the same. So even if you turn the piece around, it's different. Or, if you've got artificial light, daylight coming through a windowsill, it's always changing its mood and its feeling. And I suppose the drama it plays depends on how dramatic the light is or how soft the light is.
Yeah, absolutely. And the notion of it changing like a building in so many ways. I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about some of your influences, both in the carving and in the pattern work. Architecture clearly is one of them. What other sources have been important for you as inspiration?
Well, I've always been fascinated with nature, and the beauty, not just when you see a beautiful flower, when you deconstruct it, pull the petals off and you start looking at the inner layer, and then you start looking at the pollen. And so I've always been interested in nature, and I suppose naturally the mathematics within that kind of formation of the plant, whether, you know, it's like an orchid, or it's a three-petal plant, or so when I'm making my pieces, a lot of the names are quite influenced by architecture, plants, or music.
Music. Oh, great. Can you speak to that a little more? How are we seeing music? Yeah.
Well, music, the flow and the rhythm and the, you know, I mean, a lot of musicians over the years have loved the work because they see the ripples and flows and the kind of like the echoing of the forms that fall around the piece, or the if it's a repeat design. So there's always been that connection. But for me personally, music is a really tangible and a really important part of what I do, because I spend a lot of hours carving. So having music as company is really important, especially in the early hours. And also when you need to concentrate, you might have something very subtle on the classical, or, you know, and when you get a bit tired towards that end bit, but you need to finish those sections off, you kind of put something a bit more uplifting. But yeah, but music has always played a big part in what I do.
Interesting. I would love to hear a playlist for Tulipa, sort of what what you worked to at different stages of the project.
Well, maybe I should document. I normally, it's such eclectic and such a mad mix of music I listen to, and it depends if I have anyone else nearby working, I have to, consider that
Right.
as well.
It's interesting to think about math as being so integral to music and to your work as well. And I think one thing that I find compelling is that, you know, so often mathematics is presented almost, or is sort of an ideal. It's like an idealized language that is not subject to human variation. And I'm curious, working with clay, which is such like an imminently kind of earth material. It has so many kind of metaphorical links to, you know, our bodies as humans. It's notoriously difficult to work with. It breaks when you don't want it to. It dries in ways you don't want it to. It's sort of the opposite of a kind of ideal platonic or like a mathematical form. I'm curious if you've thought about that tension between the fallibility of ceramics and the ideal dimension of math.
I think I mean, the way I started working in this, I suppose the style that I work with over the last 25 years kind of developed naturally. It wasn't something that I subconsciously thought that's what I'm going to do. It was a natural journey, and I think my love for maths all the way through school, and my love and appreciation of visual things, you know, my surroundings, the architecture, nature, and I think all of it kind of comes together in what I do. And I think the maths and the clay, I mean, I've often had people say it's not clay, it's wood, or it's stone,
Right.
or it's,
Right.
so, you know, in the early stages of my career, people say, no, what kind of wood have you used, or what kind of stone have you used? And no, it's clay. Oh no, it can't be, you know. So I mean, I think pushing the material or doing something what isn't, I suppose, normally done with clay. You know, some of the talks I did early on in my career, you know, about keeping all the walls of a form to the same thickness is really important when you're making a vessel or when you're making a piece. But mine vary from several inches, 7 inches, sometimes 8 inches, to solid to millimeter thick. So, you know, pushing that boundary of what, you know, of what's been told or been taught, you know, because you're kind of challenging yourself. So the journey of the way I work and the style I work with was a natural journey. So, and I think the artists that I really loved, like Escher and Victor Vasarely and Bridget Riley, mainly they were 2D artists who create a lovely sense of movement through their paintings and their drawings. And I don't know, clay, I fell in love with clay because I started it when I was a late teenage, 15, 16 years old. And the teacher I had was great. He taught me all the basics. I never thought I'd be doing ceramics, but I think at university, the natural journey it took, I think my love for maths and my love for geometry and that kind of early kind of love for clay kind of came together. And it was a natural journey rather than me thinking, where I would like my career or what style I wanted. It wasn't kind of, it wasn't kind of planned, shall I say.
Right. You have to find your work in a sense, in the way that we all do to some degree, right?
Yeah. Is it like a natural journey? Because I mean, sometimes you do get lots of students or artists saying, I'm trying to find my style, or I'm trying to find, something that identifies with themselves. And I think for me, I always advise that going on a journey without any expectations, but enjoying it is what's important, and always working on your elements that you enjoy and that you're good at, rather than trying to do something what someone else is doing, because then it kind of, it's good to, I think through my college days, we copied paintings, Gauguin's and Picasso's and Monet. It's important to copy work, but when it comes to your personal self, I think having that journey and following through the things that you really love and enjoy, and it kind of creates a longevity in what you do.
It's so important, yeah, absolutely, to think about the sources of joy, in the work, and how that comes through. I would love to ask you a bit about, or to speak a little bit more about architecture, and to think about the relationship between architecture and the vessel as a form. There's long been conversations about about basically architecture as a vessel, and as sort of vessel-oriented ceramics as being understood as a type of architecture, as a kind of structure that defines space, that has an interior and an exterior, and a wall, basically a clay wall or a built or a constructed wall, kind of defining the inside and the outside. I think in this slide, we're also seeing the ways in which the interiors are as kind of dynamic and complex as the exteriors. And in some ways, you kind of really fuzz up the boundary between the interior and the exterior with the depth of your carving in particular. So I think the question in there for me is, how closely do you think about your vessel forms as spaces, or as architectural spaces in that sense? So not just the ornament and the surface of historic buildings, say in Liverpool, but thinking about them as containers.
As a young child, or as as inspiration, with cathedrals and mosques and synagogues and all these beautiful buildings, these kind of dome-like buildings, which were like vessels upside down. And I think that kind of element of a container, or a building which is a container for people, or like the vessels to hold things, has been important. And I think subconsciously the vessel is one of the oldest forms that was created by the human hand. And I think it was just a natural progression using spherical form, which for me is a very feminine form, it's a very earthly form, and structurally it's a very sound form, because I've worked with a square form. I did a series of work, and depending how I carved into it, it used to weaken the corners. So if the clay went too hot, you always got a bit of droopiness on the form. And the spherical form as the structure is really sound. And in my early work, I only carved one surface of the form. And as my work got confident, and this kind of, I suppose, this revisiting my love of architecture, how there's a beautiful building, one of my favorite ones in Manchester, the John Ryland building, how the inside structures of the building coincide with the outside structures of the building, which look like ornamental elements, but were there for structural purposes. And same with when I'm carving in one side of inside the form, what I'm doing on the outside kind of works with what's going inside, because you don't want to make too many weak points. And also, so you kind of glide in the angles past each other, so you're constantly considering both sides. And I think with architecture, you know, there's that whole element of beauty and structure, which is intertwined and considered, and I think for me that's why some of the most beautiful buildings are, you know, the religious buildings, I think, you know, or the kind of, you know, the kind of, you know, like there's some amazing, beautiful mosques and cathedrals, and I just think all of them all connect back to nature, because all the arches of the tree, because it's a really structural and strong formation of a structure and a form, and different elements within the buildings are all again connected to nature, and I feel over the years the reason my work has been well responded to by everyday people is because it has that kind of connection with nature and these beautiful buildings which are connected to nature as well.
I'm glad that you brought up this question of religious architecture, because I feel like there's something in the work that relates to spirituality and a sense of a kind of contemplative, sort of restful, you know, kind of musing that's on a plane that's very much connected to the world and is, you know, comes out of nature, as you say, but also seems to speak to another dimension of thought. I'm curious how you think about spirituality in your work.
Well, I think, you know, my work has fed my soul, and spiritually has always uplifted me, and because it's such a meditative process, it almost, yeah, no, I mean, I believe, I mean, you know, I believe in nature and about looking after the world around us, and I believe in all of us as one, as a human race. I believe that we all come from the earth, we all go back to the earth like clay, and I think that's why a lot of people naturally connect to clay as a material. We drink from it, we eat from it, and it just has a beautiful connection. And so, you know, listen to music, you know, that kind of rhythm, that flow, you know, where we live is in the countryside, so just listen to the sheep, or, you know, the birds singing. It's all yeah, I mean, yes, I would say I'm more spiritual than religious.
It can be hard to speak to a little bit in a way, because it's not, I mean, I think one of the real, for me, one of the real strengths of your work is how all of the references are really hybridized in a sense. So it can look a little bit like Gothic architecture, it can look a little bit like Islamic ornament, it can look a little bit like maybe some wood carving, you know, African wood carving, say from West Africa, and that you keep these references in balance with each other, so that it's not any one specific source, but rather the viewer, you know, us as viewers kind of bring our own associations and connections.
For me, I always believe, again, you know, because what I do is for myself, you know, the ideas come within. I love looking at things, but when I'm designing, I like to be by myself with my design book. So I don't particularly go and look at something like a flower. I absorb it as my day-to-day life, and so when I'm designing, you know, and I think it's really important, and I think that's why my work, you know, it kind of it connects with different ages and different backgrounds and different cultures, because it's pattern based, and pattern to me is a universal language that is understood by so many people in so many ways. So like you said, you know, over the years people say, oh, this looks very Moroccan, this looks very North African, this looks very Celtic, it looks very neo-Gothic, or you know, so people have this relationship with pattern and shape and form naturally. So I think, yeah, patterns are universal language, and I think, you know, I often get asked, you know, what if you run out of designs? And I think, well, if you imagine that every snowflake that falls, each one is a completely different design, so I'm sure I'll be okay.
Right. You're on safe ground. Yeah. I love this connection between sort of the rationality of mathematics in your design process and kind of dividing up space or thinking about symmetry on a given multiple, sort of then making this leap to something that is universal or spiritual, or that speaks to a plane of our existence that's more abstract in a sense.
I mean, for me, as an artist, I mean, for me, it's really important as an artist that people connect to my work. I don't know, as a child, I needed to touch things, I needed to walk around things, I need to even sometimes sit within things just because it felt so beautiful, or be with things. So I think as a human race, we need that kind of visual element around us, of plants of beauty, of objects of beauty, so to create things that people enjoy is important to me. My work is not really political, or has a kind of, it's more about being within, like within nature. It's about being with the piece of work. So that whole idea that the mood of the piece changes because the light of the day is changing, and there's a gentleman who had a piece and he goes, I used to sometimes turn it upside down so I could see the bottom, and sometimes I used to have it the other way because he had it on the mirror glass table which had a mirror below it, so it could see sides all the time, but he always turned it around. And it's like a beautiful plant that you might have in your house. You kind of turn it around so that it's kind of it's catching the light differently. And I think having work that people can connect to without having to really understand it is important as well. I don't think you have to have a big description to explain stuff. I think it's lovely that if people want to know more about it, to read, but I think for every day people should just enjoy, and it's like walking through a beautiful countryside or a garden. You just enjoy. You don't have to be stopped and question yourself unless you like to know the name of every plant.
Right. right. There's
I've got
different
friends,
ways.
I've got friends who know both the English and the Latin name and stuff like, which is lovely. But I mean, the involvement that you get involved in art should be individual, and and personal to that person, and that's for me what art should be about.
Fantastic. I would love to ask you about this project, Virtues of Unity. Maybe you could just introduce the project to the participants here.
Yeah, Virtues of Unity was a project that started through personal experience in 2009, whilst I visited Pakistan for the first time since I was born in Pakistan and came back as a toddler, and then always had this urge to go back to Pakistan and Kashmir, and then when I was 34, I actually went back to Pakistan during doing some research at the different various universities there, and I think growing up in Manchester and that kind of varying kind of name calling you get, I suppose, all over the world about, immigrant or foreigner and stuff like this. And, but I always felt like if I went visiting Pakistan, I might feel like I belong. And so in my early mid-30s, I went to Pakistan, and at the universities, at the 3 different universities that I was doing the research at, each one of them would always introduce me. This is a foreigner from England, Halima Cassell. And they all did the same. And I was quite thrown back because there's me thinking I'd go back to Pakistan, get reconnected to where my parents were from, where my ancestors were from and stuff. But all of a sudden, I was called a foreigner as well in Pakistan. So it just got me thinking about this idea of migration, about about us as a whole, as a species. And since the early days of man, we've always been a migrating species. So this idea of belonging became really interesting to me. Like I said before, my work's not very political, but this idea of belonging because of the situation. And so this idea of making a vessel, which is again a really symbolic form, out of clay to represent each country of the world, and each piece is named a virtue, a different virtue, And for me personally, with my background, or growing up in in both a Muslim and a multicultural kind of, like multicultural upbringing, Western upbringing, to understand, no matter what our background, our inheritance, our religion, our status, all of us as a human race have this connection that we share with our virtues, whether we come from a very developed country or some, a little village in Timbuktu. We all have this kind of innate kind of virtues that we have: charity, hope, giving. There's so many virtuous words. So each vessel is named after a virtue. And eventually there will hopefully be all the countries of the world in this installation. And this idea that people can resonate with the idea that we all come from the earth, we all go back to the earth. And as a race, the only thing what differs us, like the clay bodies, is the colour and texture. So and over the years, as the work's been shown at different institutions and different museums, a lot of people have had this kind of unsettling sense of belonging, and after seeing the installation, they felt like it's giving them some kind of resolution, because I believe, after having this experience, that where we choose to live becomes our home. Where we work, where we pay our taxes, where we have our family, that becomes our home. We shouldn't feel like we don't belong. So the virtues of unity was this idea of understanding that we are a migrating species, and that we are all one, and that we all come from the earth and go back to the earth.
And this is an ongoing project, correct?
Yes, it's an ongoing project, and it's lovely because it started off with this idea, and now you have an idea, and again, it wasn't planned. It was something that happened through experience, and then it's growing. And then when people go on holiday or go see family or going to work somewhere, they tend to bring me some clay back, enough to make a vessel, so I can carve into it. And sometimes the clay is literally dug out of the ground, but it's still got all the plastic and the donkey hair and whatever. So some clays have been refined to the point that local potters will use it, so it's really subtly refined. And then some are super refined because they've been refined in a pottery manufacturer place. So I try to use the clay how it comes, and the more comfortable I feel, the more complex the design might be, or less information I have, the more I kind of taper down the design a bit.
Does the design on each of these forms relate to the unit, to the virtue itself, or to the location of the origin of the clay?
I mean, some of them are named with the idea of the country that they come from, and some of the patterning. It's funny because recently the installation's gone to one of the Brookfield properties where the exhibition is, and there was a guy from Ghana, and he said, I thought these were from Ghana. All of them look like from Ghana patterns. And I thought, all from Ghana. I said, no, there is a Ghana clay, but they're not all from
Right.
Because he says Ghana pattern is so important in Ghana, and, showing me different symbols and different shapes and forms, that what they meant. Yeah, no, so the project is growing slowly, and each venue it's gone to, it's been a different, because new pieces have been added to it. So this last exhibition, 2 new pieces, one from the UAE has been added, and Luxembourg. Last year it went to 3 different venues, and over that year there's 12 new pieces added to it. So
yeah, wow, very active.
Yeah, I think because we had a long period of lockdown, didn't we? And then I was collecting clay, and then obviously I made them for so, and then next year when it travels, then obviously then it will go to there'll be more pieces added, but eventually there'll be about 200 pieces, what we're creating the whole of the installation.
Wow, amazing. And do you see like I understand that a lot of times people will bring you clay from different places, but do you try to travel to different locations to kind of find clay yourself?
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm always if I go somewhere, then definitely I try and get some clay from the country, but I don't. I'm always doing my work, and I have a young family, so I don't travel as much as I'd like to travel, because my family and my work my priority. So,
Yeah.
and it's nice because the clay has more of a story when other people get it, because so I get them to collect me the information of why they're there and who they got the clay from, like the clay from, let's say, I mean, each one's got a really lovely story, not the ones what have been bought for me, and like the South African one of my students went out there, and she saw a street artist making clay animals, and she asked him for some clay, and he went out and he got some clay from a riverbed, and it was too much, so they played with clay with their grandchildren and bought some of this clay back, and then obviously we refined it. My partner and I worked together, so we refined it, we dried it, and then sieved it and took all the impurities out. Other times I use the clay directly. So Costa Rica, the clay came from debris, what comes from a volcanic downpour, and then falls down this waterfall. And then over the years, there's a kind of impact with the various minerals where the clay develops. So the local people use the clay from the bottom of this water feature. So you get this marbling of, grays and blues in the clay. So the Costa Rica clay, I've tried to use it as pure as it's come. So you see these veins of colours in it. So the Ghana, not the Ghana, the Bosnian clay looks like chili cheese because it's like red with all these little bits of colours of black and orange and red in it. And so, you get this, I'm sure if I did more into it, if I wedged it, so each clay has its different kind of feel. And the clay from Luxembourg was beautiful to use. It fires really successfully when I did the tests at different levels. Where the UAE clay was, it's very different clay. I've never used clay like that before. A bit difficult, but luckily the piece turned out really well.
I think one thing that I love about this piece is that it just really speaks to, in a very eloquent and poetic way, to the universality of clay as a medium for humans, in the present and certainly over time, and how when we're looking like at the slide, at the image on the left, at a selection of the kind of the range of colors of the clay and textures that we can see a bit, that there's really no way to know just by looking where any of these clays is from.
Talking about spirituality and the connection with the earth and that, I've had a few encounters where, like one of the exhibitions, it was early on this year at the Mesem Gallery, and there was a child. I mean, obviously the board of where the clays were on the wall and could read, and he kind of said, "Mommy, this is my favorite piece," and it was actually from their country, from where his parents were from. And when I was doing a talk at the Manchester Museum several years ago, the installation was on a circular plinth, and a lady said to me, "Oh, for your talk," she stood further back, "there's one piece what kind of calling her," and she goes, "After your talk, I went up to it, and it was from Poland, and she was Polish." So I think that connection with the earth, that kind of, that deep sense of connection and belonging, and being intuitive with the earth and with your feelings is something that we take for granted, I think.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing those. I do want to invite our participants to add any questions to the Q&A if you like. I do have a few more things to ask Halima myself, but of course happy to have questions from the group. I do want to ask one more question before we go to Q&A. I think we see it in this work really clearly, which are some of the pieces have larger voids in them, or kind of openings in the walls. Curious if you could speak to, we spoke a little bit about the idea of vessel and container and connection to architecture and a kind of interior and exterior space. How do you see the voids or the openings being important parts?
I was going to answer that before I know you asked the question, so I was going to go back to that and then I forgot. So with my normal work, everything is carved, and then all the edges are burnished, and the lines are made very sharp. The inner and outer lines of the forms are made super sharp as I physically can. But the virtues of Unity, I just carve every piece so it has a softer finish, so that when you put them in color gradation, softness will kind of blend into the next one. And so it has that what connects them all, but also when the pieces are displayed together, the holes that are carved through the pieces. So if it's a symmetry of 3, it'll have 3 holes. If it's symmetry of 8, it'll have 8 holes. Sometimes each one has a hole.
I see.
There's various elements of reasoning to this. One of them was when I started the installation, I was pregnant. And this idea, you know, I was always, I mean, I had children quite late, but I've always loved pregnant women. I think they're the most beautiful looking, you know, the most marvel thing in the world. And so when I was pregnant, I was so delighted. And I just thought, you know, a mother giving birth was the most magical thing as well. You know, when you see animal giving birth, when you see, and you think of Mother Earth, the Earth, you know, as a spherical form as well. And by having these piercing of the hole, it was like light connecting one piece to another piece. And so you see, so when they're displayed quite closely, they start connecting and working together as a whole. And I think as a human race, if we work together, you know, as a whole, we'll be much stronger, much better for it. And yeah, no, light penetrating from one to another is what we should do to each other. We should, you know, send that energy out to each other, you know, every one of us, as you know. And if you're positive, if you have a smile on your face, that energy goes to someone else. If you are feeling down, that, you know, so I think that energy of light, you know, you cast on each other is really important.
Fantastic. Sort of letting our light shine right through those openings.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a couple of times that you don't see your work as being political. But I think that one could make an argument that a work like this actually is quite political.
You know, there's a lovely writer, Andrew Lambert, who wrote a lovely essay, and he said it's political with a little p.
With a small p.
And because my work, it wasn't meant to be, it happened through a personal experience, and it's meant to be softly making people aware, you know, of us accepting each other and accepting each other's differences, because what is similar is far greater. You know, our DNA, our virtues, you know, our DNA, you know, is all the same, and it just differs slightly depending where we come from. It's like having an oak tree, a seed, and you're planting one in, you know, in Scotland, and then planting one in Cornwall. The leaves and the kind of the way the plant forms is going to be different, because it rains a lot in Scotland and it's sunny in the south of England. So the same seed, what's come from the seeds what come from the same plant, will differ to adapt to their environment. And I think it's the same with us as human race. You know, we adapt to our environment. Our skin's darker where it's a lot sunnier, and our skin's lighter, and you know, our eyes are, you know, bluer. Yeah, there's all reasons to everything with nature, with food, with the things that grow around us. There's a purpose for, you know, all the plants we have in our garden and weeds that we have, like dandelions. What, you know, in England, everyone hates dandelions, but the properties such a simple plant can have in everything from the root to the leaves to the flowers are so important to us.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So we've had a question from the group is asking whether you have a favorite among the virtues.
It's hard because each time you carve a piece, your moment, for me, that moment of carving and that moment of enjoyment and that moment of revealing that 2D design into a 3D visualization is, for me, what kind of lifts me and keeps me going. Favorites would be more down to how easy the clay was to work with. There's been some very difficult clays, you know, one being the Pakistani. There's the Welsh clay, which was really difficult, which I had to remake the piece and add a bit of ball clay to add, you know, various things into to strengthen it to stop it from cracking. The AE clay was quite difficult to use. I've never known anything to dry on my tools where that clay did.
Wow.
So it had a completely different feel to it. And I think I think the clay that I got from Greece was really beautiful. The German clay, some of the European clays, like the Belgian clays, are beautiful to use, and the Japanese clay was beautiful to use. So I think it's enjoyment of when I'm doing it. As a whole, if I was to choose my favorite pieces, that would be difficult.
I can imagine, for sure. Maybe it's yet to come, actually.
Yeah, maybe. It's like saying which one of my children are my favorite.
I know. Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. So,
Yeah.
you know, you've mentioned like being pregnant and just now children, and I'm curious how you think of gender in your work and whether sort of where kind of how gender comes through within your pieces, or whether the forms have a kind of gender specificity to them.
Without realizing it, I think the spherical form was one of the earliest forms that I worked with, and I did I had my first few exhibition. I had one square form, and I think that's when I realized how masculine and feminine, or how people perceive masculine and feminine. And this one square form, which traveled to a few exhibitions, the men were a magnet to it.
Yeah.
And people would often say about my normal work, it's very feminine, it's very spiritual, it's very earthly, it's, you know, because of the round shape. And I suppose I didn't see that, because I thought my work, because all my early work was very rectilinear, very Anglo, very masculine. Because I think it was me growing up with brothers, you know, who were a lot, you know, I suppose in my cultural background, were able to do a lot more than I was able to do. So I had this issue of being strong through my work. So everything was, and people who didn't know I did my work always presumed a male did it, which I quite liked, you know, because it looked, you know, so I'm thinking in my head at the time with these young issues, as a young person, I liked it looking quite masculine and quite architecture, because architecture tends to look quite, and so the work's got soft over the years, but during an exhibition touring exhibition with Bolton Museum years ago, I was commissioned to make a series of work, and I made a series of square forms. I think for the whole exhibition, I made 12 square forms, new ones, over a year and a half, and all of them, bar one, sold to men. And so it's funny how the form, some people say the form, to me, form is secondary. To me, a form is like a canvas, like a paper, you know, something that you work on. But for some people, it's the first thing they see. Design-wise, I think the curvilinear design, what goes into the work, I think it's the natural kind of flow of water and air and, you know, fabric, and so it connects quite widely to people. So having that element of softness within the hard, you know, planes is quite important.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we'll wrap up with the final question from the group, and I'll read it out here. It asks, being an artist of color, have you found that your identity plays a role in how others perceive your work, or that they come to it with pre-existing expectations?
I mean, for me, I've always seen the world as one. Even as a child, I did, you know, when anyone made a comment, you know, I always just saw us as one. So I think I've never gone out there to make a big statement about my background. I think for me, it's about making out what's true to me, and what's been really beautiful for myself is that because of that journey and because of that connection to nature and geometry, it connects to so many people of background, culture, age, you know. So I don't think I've actually gone out there to do anything, but I think people naturally connect the work to cathedrals, to mosques, to different cultures. There's going back to that idea of pattern being a universal language.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It's been a real pleasure to be able to speak with you and to have this conversation with the group. And of course, to have your work at the Gardiner. where it is on view as part of our ICAF, our ceramic art fair, until June 2nd. So I invite everyone to come into the gallery and see Halima's work in person for yourself. And thank you so much, Halima.
Yes, thank you. And I look forward to seeing some pictures of it in situ. I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but yeah, no, thank you so much. And if there's any more questions, do let me know.
Will do, absolutely. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a fantastic day.
You too.